Canada is one of the largest economies in the world with a nominal GDP of $1.9 trillion. Canada is the 8th largest economy in the world. Canada's economy is highly developed and the country is rich in natural resources such as oil, natural gas, and metals. Its economy is reliant on international trade as well. But just how did Canada transform itself to become one of the largest economies in the world? In this video, we will be exploring Canada's economy, tracing from its origins to the modern day in order to analyze the rise of Canada's economy up to the modern day. Canada is a resource-rich nation, and its vast natural resources have led to much of its economic development in past centuries. Known as the staple thesis, Canada's economy developed due to a handful of staple commodities which it traded with Great Britain. These commodities consisted of fish, fur, timber, and wheat. Although now a unified nation, Canada's terrain is vast and very much a regional nation, as certain regions developed differently based off what commodity they were abundant with. The earliest economic activity in Canada began in the 16th century when Europeans from France, Portugal, Spain, and Great Britain sailed to the east coast of Canada to fish, then returned back to Europe with the fish. Settlements arose around these fisheries. Fisheries arose in other parts of Canada as well, as it became a major industry. Fur was another major commodity that Canada produced. In Europe, hats made from beaver fur were in high demand. The forests of Canada were abundant in animals whose fur were used to make hats, which were sold to Europeans. Throughout the 17th century, France colonized much of Canada, and the French colonies within Canada became known as New France. The French dominated the fur trade throughout the 17th century. However, the English competed with the French and traded fur through the Hudson Bay, and established the Hudson Bay Company, which still exists to this day. Throughout the 18th century, the British seized much of New France and turned those territories into British colonies. Timber became the primary staple economy beginning in the 18th century. Britain drained its domestic timber supply and looked elsewhere for timber. It turned to its colonies in Canada, which had an abundance of timber. The timber trade became massive and soon turned into one of the most essential industries in Canada. Unlike the fur trade, the timber trade required a lot of manpower. Many Europeans sailed to North America and sought employment in the timber industry. New immigrants came to Canada and formed various settlements and migrated westward. These settlements needed food and initially imported food from the United States, which was quite expensive. This created a demand for local goods. As a result, farmers moved into many of these settlements in order to provide cheaper food. Farming became more prevalent in Canada and formed the basis of many of these new settlements. In the 18th century, the timber industry led to the development of canals in order to improve the transportation of timber. Many railways were developed as well, which helped link the different regions of Canada and improved trade throughout the colonies, so they were less reliant on imports from the United States. The railroads were massive investments, and many Canadian colonies had bankrupted themselves due to the massive subsidies they had provided to the railway companies. The Atlantic colonies wanted a railroad but were too disunited to construct one for themselves. In addition, England had imposed tariffs on imports in order to protect their domestic industry, which significantly hurt the Canadian colonies' economies, as they were also reliant on England for trade. The colonies were worried about their economic future and wanted to be able to establish a strong domestic economy as well as a national railroad system to aid in this endeavor. Thus, in 1867, the colonies of Canada passed the British North America Act in 1867, which united the colonies into a self-governing confederation. The construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway was completed in 1885, uniting the eastern half with the western half of the nation. People began to migrate westward, and the population of Canada expanded. New technologies allowed farmers in the southern prairies to grow wheat, which became the new staple commodity during this time. Farmers used the railways to transport wheat to the nation's ports, which were then shipped to Europe. From the years 1896 through 1914, Canada was the world's fastest growing economy. In the 1930s, Canada's economy was hit hard by the Great Depression.
Its economy, reliant on international trade, was hit hard during the Depression when other nations seized to buy its products. By 1933, in the midst of the Depression, 30% of the labor force was unemployed. On top of this, a dust bowl had devastated agricultural yield in the southern prairies, causing 250,000 Canadian farmers to flee to British Columbia and Ontario. The consequences of the Great Depression, in combination with the Dust Bowl, culminated in the 1930s being one of the worst decades for Canada's economy in history. At the start of World War II, the Canadian economy underwent a dramatic transformation and experienced one of the largest economic booms the country had ever seen. Wheat, lumber, and other resources were exported to Great Britain as well as other allied nations, as demand for resources soared due to the war. Canada's mining sector provided the Allies with 40% of its aluminum, 75% of its nickel, 15% of zinc, and 12% of its copper during the war. Canada's natural resources made the nation $5.8 billion during this period. Canadian factories were repurposed and began to manufacture weapons, munitions, and other war supplies. People from rural parts of the nation migrated to urban areas to find work in the factories. Unemployment rates went from 11.4% in 1939 to just 1.4% by 1944. Canada's economy soared and completely transformed itself throughout the war, and the economic consequences of the Great Depression ceased.
The period following World War II cemented Canada's economic foundation. Although still reliant on exporting its natural resources to other nations, Canada's economy shifted following World War II as a new middle class developed. Now a highly industrialized nation, more people began to live closer to the cities to find work. This led to the rise of the suburbs. Demand for houses grew, and construction of houses became a major industry in the economy. Unemployment was relatively low, wages were high, and this stability led to the formation of the middle class. New technologies emerged, such as televisions, automobiles, and refrigerators. This new middle class of people had much more disposable income than previous generations, and this resulted in continuous consumer demand for new products, which helped propel the economy. Automobile manufacturing became one of the nation's most significant industries during this time. The government also invested heavily in constructing highways and hydroelectric dams, which provided employment to many and helped modernize the nation's infrastructure. Perhaps the most significant economic event during this time was the discovery of oil near Alberta. Canada was never considered an oil-rich nation until this oil discovery. Upon discovery, Canada soon started producing significant amounts of oil, from producing nearly nothing in the early 1940s to producing over 500,000 barrels a day by the 1960s. A pipeline constructed from Edmonton, Alberta to the coast of British Columbia was completed in 1953, known as the Trans Mountain Pipeline. To this day, the energy sector is vital to the Canadian economy. Although the nation added many new industries during this time, Canada still remained primarily a nation dependent on trade, mainly with the United States. By the 1960s, the United States received 60% of all Canada's exports. It is also important to note that although post-war growth and development was significant throughout Canada's economy, this economic growth was uneven, and much of the growth occurred near major cities. The prairie economies of Manitoba and Saskatchewan, as well as the Atlantic side of Canada, did not experience much of this growth, which created much inequality throughout the nation, which still exists to this day.
Canada's economy continued to grow throughout the following decades. As the middle class grew larger and larger, the government had to expand its infrastructure to accommodate the growing population. By the 70s, the government was saddled in debt. The 80s marked a period of economic liberalization. Trade policies with the United States were formed, such as the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, which reduced tariffs between the two nations. The North American Free Trade Agreement, otherwise known as NAFTA, was another free trade agreement between the US, Canada, as well as Mexico, which further eliminated tariffs between the three nations. A result of these policies was the decline and offshoring of manufacturing jobs. Manufacturing jobs were outsourced to the United States and Mexico. Furthermore, increased competition from nations like Japan and China during this time also led to the decline of manufacturing in Canada. Although economic liberalization and globalization led to the decline of Canada's manufacturing industry, it also led to the development of an abundant technology sector in Canada, one that still flourishes to this day.
Today, Canada's economy is the 8th largest in the world when measured by GDP. The nation is still prominent in global trade, exporting $637 billion worth of goods and importing $631 billion worth of goods in 2021 alone. Canada's largest trading partner is by far the United States. The country is still rich in natural resources, as it contains a total value of nearly $34 trillion worth of natural resources. It is also an oil-rich nation, with the 3rd largest oil reserve in the world. It is the world's 4th most prominent oil exporter and 5th most prominent exporter of natural gas. Other essential Canadian exports are cars, car parts, industrial machinery, steel, metals, and agricultural products such as wheat and grain. The services sector in Canada is the largest employer, employing 3/4 of the population and making up 70% of the nation's GDP. Among the services sector, major industries include retail, financial services, and real estate, as well as the tourism industry. Although having significantly declined in recent decades, Canada's manufacturing industry is still essential to its economy, comprising of roughly 10% of the nation's GDP and employing 1.7 million individuals. Overall, the foundation of Canada's economy, although now much larger and more diversified than what it was in its past, is still reliant on trade. The country has transformed itself into a highly industrialized, prosperous nation. However, despite its progress, the country is not without its fair share of economic challenges. One of the most pertinent challenges Canada faces are its exorbitant housing prices. The average price of a home in Canada is roughly $626,000, roughly 9 times more than the average household income. In some areas, such as Toronto, the average home price exceeds $1 million. However, these figures are at a 22-month low, as housing prices have fallen since the Bank of Canada has increased interest rates. Despite this, the housing market has turned into a bubble and has priced out many potential home buyers. The real estate bubble is a result of a culmination of factors, mainly foreign and domestic speculation. A 2019 government report found that 1/5 of all home purchases in Canada are from investors. In some areas like Toronto, over 1/3 of condos are owned by investors who do not live there. In 2017, as a result of the real estate bubble, the Canadian government put into place certain regulations in an attempt to modulate the real estate market and make housing more affordable. However, beginning in 2020, as a result of the pandemic, the Bank of Canada reduced interest rates in an attempt to stimulate growth, as well as remove regulations from banks which allowed them to make riskier loans. As a result, housing prices skyrocketed once again as demand for housing soared. Overall, the housing affordability crisis is a pervasive national problem the country will need to contend with in upcoming years.
Canada, like most Western countries, has a stagnating birth rate. Birth rates are stagnant, therefore many jobs go unfilled well into the future if this trend continues.
Therefore, Canada has turned to skilled immigration to fill the jobs of its labor force. Today, immigration to Canada is the main driver of population growth. Skilled immigration is a great way to attract talent, but it also adds to the housing affordability crisis. Canada has one of the lowest rates of productivity in the workplace among developed nations. Productivity is defined as the rate at which goods and services are produced relative to the amount of tools that are used to produce those goods and services. The more that goods and services are produced relative to the amount of tools used to produce those goods, the higher productivity increases. Productivity is closely associated with wages and standard of living, as well as economic growth. Wages in Canada have remained stagnant in recent years. One of the immediate effects of this is increased immigration to the United States from Canada for people in search of higher wages. On average, 45,000 Canadians every year immigrate to the United States, whereas only roughly 7,500 US citizens immigrate to Canada. Canada's low wages make it difficult to retain skilled workers. Canada will continue to struggle with economic growth in upcoming decades due to its low productivity rates. According to a recent OECD report, Canada will have among one of the slowest rates of economic growth amongst developed nations due to its low productivity levels. This paints a bleak picture as it predicts the wages and standard of living will remain stagnant in upcoming decades unless the government can work with businesses to find solutions to increase productivity levels. In summary, Canada certainly faces its fair share of challenges well into the future. As a former British colony, the country has come a long way from where it started and has transformed itself into a wealthy, developed nation. I'm confident that Canada will find solutions to its problems and continue to prosper well into the future.